Hello and welcome to this video in which I'm going to make you an expert in the witches in Macbeth. So we start with this front page of King James I's book. It's published in Scotland in 1597 and it's called Deamonologie. And the reason King James wrote it was to prove that witches existed and also to outline some of their powers. Now, King James came to the throne in 1603 and published it in England at the same time. Macbeth is written in 1605, 1606. So this is really new. And Shakespeare wants to ingratiate himself, which means to get on the right side of King James. So he puts the witches in the play. But the big question that you want to answer is, does he just put them there to please King James, or does he actually believe in witchcraft himself? And the other key thing we're going to look at is your understanding of the witches, because I hope I'm going to change your point of view about them. So this is a typical representation about what the three witches might look like in Macbeth. The first thing you'll notice, I hope, is that although they're quite ugly, none of them are obviously male, and none of them have beards. And this might puzzle you because you will have watched possibly several film versions, and in every film version I've ever seen, the witches don't have beards. But in Shakespeare's play, they clearly do. He references it, as you will see in a minute in the dialogue, and that's important, because modern adaptations don't properly take account of what Shakespeare was up to. So you're going to find out some stuff in this video that other students don't know. And the other really useful thing for you about the video is I'm going to take you through the witches chronologically through the play. So here we are at the beginning, and the bit that I want to focus on is when the hurly-burly's done, when the battle's lost and won. So right at the very beginning of the play, Shakespeare wants to portray the witches as ambiguous. And by ambiguous, I mean we don't know if they're wholly evil. And we also don't know how powerful they are. And this is embodied in this idea of the battle being lost and won at the same time. That's ambiguous, isn't it? Whose point of view is it lost from? Whose point of view is it won from? So, for example, you can say, well, it's clear the battle's lost because Norway's been beaten and Macbeth has won. But if we take the ambiguity a little further, well, has the battle been won? Duncan, who's defending himself, has actually lost the battle because as a result of the battle, Macbeth kills Duncan. Okay, well, let's look at Macbeth. As a result of him winning the battle, he's actually lost because he ends up killing Duncan, and that leads to his own tragedy. So this idea of ambiguity is present with the witches as well. They introduce it to us, and we have to ask, are they supernatural or not? Are they evil or not? What exactly is going on? Right, but this quotation is also really cool in another way. And I was taught this by a student just last week at school, and she said to me, "Sir, I've had this brilliant idea. The witches meet right at the beginning of the play, before Macbeth is in the battle. Do you think," she said, "do you think that the witches are meeting to put a protective spell on Macbeth to stop him being killed in the battle? Because obviously if he gets killed in the battle, none of the tragedy can unfold." That's a really interesting question, isn't it? So I said, well, what do we know about Macbeth in the battle? She said, well, he fights without his helmet on, he gets rid of his shield. Actually, he really does risk death. In fact, it's a real miracle, isn't it, that he survives unscathed, untouched. And so she was using that as evidence that actually the witches do have some sort of supernatural power and protect Macbeth from harm. Now, it's never made clear because Shakespeare wants us to ask that question, but he doesn't want to give us the answer, which is strange. You'd think that to get on the right side of King James, he'd want to show that the witches are supernatural and they definitely do have power, But he doesn't do that. Shakespeare's much more interested in the possibility of the psychological flaws in Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and he leaves the ending of the play open to us to say, well, actually the witches had no real power at all. It was all Macbeth's own fault. See what you think as we go through. So now we come to their final line of that scene: fair is foul and foul is fair. And again, you've got this idea of ambiguity. What seems wonderful is fair, actually turns out to be horrible. Foul, that's Macbeth's kingship, isn't it? But also, what seems foul, the witches, actually might turn out to be good. Really puzzling idea. So how might the witches be a force for good? Well, if you've watched any of my videos looking at the patriarchal society, you will have an instinct of what the witches represent here. They represent women's attempts to gain power in a society that's set up to give power only to men. And consequently, as we dig deeper, you'll see that all their attacks in the play are only against male characters, never against the female characters. They are complaining about the patriarchal society. They want to change it so that women have more power. And we could go a step further and say, well, a society like this only creates witches because women in it are denied power in the normal world, and so surely it's natural for them to turn to superstition or the occult or the devil to try and achieve power through another route. So although it's a sailor's wife who refuses to give the first witch some chestnuts, it's the husband who gets punished. Her husband's to Aleppo gone, master of the tiger, but in a sieve I'll thither sail, and like a rat without a tail, I'll do, and I'll do. So it's him that she wants to get revenge on. We could go a step further here and see how unlikely it is that she will be able to do as she says. So even her desire for revenge might be a signal that she's powerless. For example, a sieve is a tiny little boat, and she's going to have to sail it on her own, which is highly unlikely. And like a rat without a tail, again symbolises through simile how she is also powerless. A rat without a tail would be less of a rat, unbalanced. And the fact that she can't name what she'll do and instead repeats it without naming it suggests that she knows she won't be able to do anything at all. The other witches leap to her defence and say, well, look, I'll give you a wind, and so on. So we might see this as a possibility, or equally, through ambiguity again, we might see it as a forlorn hope. She wants revenge, but actually we know she can't get it. And that explains why the revenge is aimed at the sailor and not the wife, because it is men who are denying women power. And next we have an interesting autobiographical detail from Shakespeare. So this sailor, though his bark cannot be lost, the bark is his boat, yet it shall be tempest tossed. Look what I have. So the autobiographical detail here is King James, who believed he was attacked by witches in a storm, in a tempest. He believed that off the coast of Scotland, witches raised this storm and tried to kill him through sinking his boat, but couldn't. But another way of looking at that story isn't to say that witches have this supernatural power. It's also to say that perhaps they don't have that power at all. Tempest is a natural event. The boat didn't even sink. And here, the witch is saying that she doesn't have the power to sink the boat. So Shakespeare's asking us a question here. Is our belief in the supernatural fictitious? And when we get to the end of the play, of course, there's nothing to show that any of the characters were actually controlled by the witches. It's open to our interpretation. Now, some scholars see this as a potential attack on King James, making fun of King James's belief, which is also possible. But to do so would have been really risky because Shakespeare's company of actors is directly sponsored by the king's patronage. They become the king's players, that's their name. So it's unlikely that Shakespeare intended for the king to realise that he was making fun of this belief in witchcraft. So let's come down to this next quotation here. Here I have a pilot's thumb, wrecked as homeward he did come. So this again is a symbol of male power being overcome. The pilot is the person who steers the boat, just like the witches want to steer Macbeth. However, there's no indication here that the witches have been able to sink this pilot's boat. They're just opportunistic. The boat's already sunk, presumably because the pilot went the wrong way, because it was coming homeward, and so the pilot has made a mistake, and they use this to try and make Macbeth make mistakes. So this suggests that they don't necessarily have real power over him. However, you can look at it the other way. They're going to use the influence of this pilot who was a bad pilot, who made the wrong decisions coming homeward, to do exactly the same with Macbeth. And of course, he makes the wrong decisions at home. It's at his own home, his own castle, that he decides to kill Duncan. And we can argue that's what wrecks his kingship. Because of course, if the witches are right, then Macbeth can become king anyway. He doesn't have to kill Duncan to do so. And they finish this scene identifying themselves as the Weird Sisters. And the sisters are bound together, hand in hand. This again is a symbol of women needing power and needing each other's support to get it. So Shakespeare could be directly criticising the patriarchal society, criticising the idea that women, no matter how skilled they are, no matter how intelligent, are not allowed power. And then this final ambiguity in the scene, peace, the charms wound up, is really interesting. Why do the witches ask for peace? This is a strange thing for them to ask for. Perhaps they're thinking long term here. So when they set Macbeth to kill Duncan, they end up getting rid of Duncan's line, and that leads to Banquo's son Fleance eventually becoming king, which eventually leads to King James. So it was believed that King James was descended from Banquo. Now this is a really interesting bit of political propaganda, because on the one hand Shakespeare is saying, look, Banquo is a noble character, he does everything right in the play, and therefore King James is descended from a really noble character. But on the other hand, he's also pointing out that that descent only happens because of the witches' intervention. It's only through this evil act of the witches, where they persuade Macbeth that he can become king, perhaps through murder, that King James gets crowned eventually generations later. Now, Banquo's words also pick up on this idea of the patriarchy. He says about the witches, "You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so." Now, as I said, most modern productions, all the productions I've ever seen, get rid of the beards. They don't want this confusion between male and female. Now, on one level, this is a bit of historical context coming to play. Shakespeare deliberately has the women played by men, and in Shakespeare's time, an older man would have had a beard. That's how you would have seen his masculinity, and the younger men without beards would have been used to play female characters. But he could have chosen younger men to play the female characters without beards, but he deliberately chooses not to. He gives these women beards because he wants to symbolise something. What is it? He wants to symbolise that their desires are to become more male. This, of course, will link them to Lady Macbeth, who wants to become more male. So, if we dig a little deeper here, these women have chosen to become witches in order to achieve more power. And power is only something allowed to males in this patriarchal society, which is why they have become more masculine in appearance. We could take a slightly different view and say, well, no, actually, the beards don't symbolise how they want power, they symbolise how ugly these women are. But then the argument still works. Because women are solely judged in this society by their looks, how attractive they are to a prospective partner, then having ugly looks again denies them power. They can't marry into it. And that would also lead to the fact that they are a sisterhood. There are no men who would be interested in them because of their appearance. And therefore, again, it brings this idea of why they'd want revenge against the males in this patriarchal society. Now, Banquo, again, doesn't describe them as having supernatural powers in the sense that they can cast spells and make things happen. Instead, he gives them the gift of being able to see into the future, which in another play would be considered wisdom. So actually what we're getting here is that the supernatural power they have is merely a high degree of intelligence or a knowledge of the future. It's not an evil control of people and events. So if you can look into the seeds of time, he asks, and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me. So his understanding here is just that they can see into the future, not that they can alter it or control it. And Shakespeare sets this up as a kind of intellectual debate. Do witches actually have any power? Yes, they think they do, and they'll use all kinds of magic and ritual, but that doesn't mean that they actually can control anything. So Macbeth asks next, say from whence you owe this strange intelligence. He's asking, where do you get this information about the future from? Or why upon this blasted heath you stop our way with such prophetic greeting? And this is actually at the heart of their power. Macbeth is saying, why are you telling me this? Even if it is true, why are you telling me? And that brings us to the other role of the witches. They've actually understood Macbeth's psychological flaw, his ambition, and they know that giving him this information will control the way he behaves. So we've got another possibility now. Perhaps Macbeth would never become king because the witches don't have any view of the future. They don't see what's going to come. But what they do see is Macbeth's mind, his thinking. They have a superb psychological understanding, and they know that giving this prophecy, pretending to see the future, will actually force Macbeth into this action of killing King Duncan and starting the tragedy. So we can look at this either to say that the witches do have this supernatural ability to see the future, or it's opposite. They don't see the future, but they know they can shape it through psychological exploitation, nudging Macbeth towards his own evil ambitions. Interesting, isn't it? So Shakespeare draws some deliberate parallels between Lady Macbeth and the witches, and she also looks for supernatural power to change her status as a woman by becoming more of a man. A really, really powerful hint that Shakespeare is telling us the witch's role is to challenge the patriarchal society. So, come you spirits, Fluminet, can I get rid of these emails, that tend on mortal thoughts, unsex me here, and fill me from the crown to the toe top full of direst cruelty. So, Shakespeare's making a direct connection with the ability to be cruel is a masculine ability, and Shakespeare, as in the form of Lady Macbeth, wants to become evil and therefore needs to be unsexed. And the clear message is you cannot achieve power in this society unless you become male. And then she asks, come to my woman's breasts and take my milk for gall. She's actually asking for the ability to give milk to her child, to her baby, to be taken away. Now, she doesn't call them witches She calls them spirits, and that causes us to wonder whether they're actually evil again. Spirit is a neutral word, and when we look at this a bit more closely, their power comes from tending on mortal thoughts. So there's an admission here from Lady Macbeth that male power is not real. It's just something that exists in the minds of people in this society. So actually what she's trying to do is just change the way that people think. Now, by extension, we could argue that Shakespeare is doing the same thing. He wants to change how people think about women. It's quite a profound thought, isn't it, to think of him as a kind of feminist figure here. Of course, the conventional view of Lady Macbeth is that she is punished for not sticking to her feminine role. She's punished for actually becoming more male and for her direst cruelty. But this again could be an attack by Shakespeare on this society, because the only reason she turns to this evil way of achieving power is because she can never become queen in her own right. She simply wouldn't be recognised. She can only do so through the influence of her husband, because this is a patriarchal society. And finally, her final words of this speech are really quite interesting. This last phrase, to cry hold, hold, is planted here as a deliberate foreshadowing of Macbeth's final words when he fights Macduff, where he says, "Damned be he who first cries, hold, hold enough." And so he actually echoes Lady Macbeth's words. What this means is that Macbeth is influenced by his wife. Again, that points to a psychological reason for his behaviour, not the fact that the witches have manipulated him as much as we're led to believe. His wife's influence over him seems to be equally powerful, if not more. That's important to consider when you're trying to evaluate the power of the witches. Actually, is Lady Macbeth a more powerful figure in influencing her husband than the witches are? And Shakespeare keeps asking us that question. He keeps wanting us to keep asking, does the supernatural have real power over us, or do we only give it power through our beliefs and thoughts? So when Banquo now meets Macbeth, he tries to get Macbeth to speak about the witches' prophecies. And to get him to open up, he says, "I dreamt last night of the three weird sisters." Well, Macbeth dismisses this, "I think not of them." But let's go back to this. If we take this literally, then Banquo has dreamt of the witches last night. But if you've been paying attention to the play, they only met the witches today, after the battle. This is the same day of the battle, and it's before Duncan gets killed. So what Banquo is saying is, I've actually met these weird sisters in my dreams before we met them in real life. And now that strongly suggests that they have supernatural power. But we can look at this as a political act by Banquo. So this is in fact a lie. It's just a way of getting Macbeth to talk about the witches, presumably because Banquo wants to stop Macbeth killing Duncan. He knows that that's at the back of Macbeth's mind, and he wants to protect his friend as well as protect the king and protect Scotland. So again, Shakespeare plays with the ambiguity. The witches might have real power, or they might not. So modern directors often play with this idea of the witch's power when we come to the dagger scene here. So here are Macbeth's words. "Is this a dagger which I see before me? The handle that should be turned towards my hand, I thought. Come, let me clutch thee. I have thee not, and yet I see thee still." So clearly not a real dagger. So some directors play this as a psychological episode where we see no dagger, we just see Macbeth reacting as though he can see it and we don't, and we're left with the ambiguity. Is it in Macbeth's mind, or is it a supernatural presence? However, some directors present this with the witches holding the imaginary dagger, and Macbeth doesn't see the witches, they are an invisible force. So some directors come down very strongly on this idea of the supernatural and the witches controlling Macbeth's thoughts. However, Shakespeare doesn't. He deliberately leaves it open to our interpretation to decide whether there's no influence from the witches at all. It's just Macbeth's desires that cause him to hallucinate in this way, because they clash with his conscience, the knowledge that he should not kill the king. And that's what causes the schism. A schism is a great divide, a conflict. So the schism in his mind. And this ambiguity continues after he's killed Duncan. So he tells Lady Macbeth, "Methought I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more. Macbeth does murder sleep.'" So again, this is the schism in his mind, but it could also be supernatural. There might actually have been a voice that only he can hear. It might actually have been the witches acting on his mind, enjoying their revenge. But equally, we can look at this as not anything to do with the witches whatsoever. This is his own conscience speaking out and attacking him. Macbeth tries to hint that it might be the witches, so he says, "Glamis hath murdered sleep, and therefore Cawdor shall sleep no more." So he deliberately echoes the welcome from the witches, where they hail him Thane of Glamis, and then they hail him Thane of Cawdor. But then they hail him as king. But here, Macbeth doesn't name himself as king, he names himself as Macbeth. So again, we could read this as him trying to claim the witches have spoken to him like this, but the final part of the sentence suggests that no, perhaps it is he himself, Macbeth, who has created that voice. Otherwise, they would have said, "King Macbeth shall sleep no more." Interesting, isn't it? Okay, well now we get a bit of a change of tone. So the witches disappear from the play for a long time until Macbeth decides to go back and visit them. And what we have is a new character called Hecate, who is female. So many scholars think that Hecate is created late in the writing process, simply to give one of his main actors a part. So it's written with a particular actor in mind who's not playing elsewhere in the play. And part of the reason that they assume this is when we look at the dialogue here that's given to Hecate, it just doesn't feel like Shakespeare. And there's the suspicion that this actor has written his own part. So instead of being written in 10 syllables lines, the lines now suddenly become 8 syllables long. And if I jump forward a bit to the spell, the charm that the witches join in with together after they've met Hecate, the syllable pattern changes again. Eye of newt and toe of frog, wool of bat and tongue of dog, adder's fork and blindworm's sting, lizard's leg and owlet's wing. You can see it's a really childish sort of rhythm. And it's often 6 syllables per line, not Shakespeare-like at all. So one possible interpretation of this is that Shakespeare's making fun of the idea of witches. This scene, which is supposed to reveal their power, actually does the opposite. It shows how their spells are almost a childish game. And the rhythm of the spell is not sinister at all, it's quite cheerful. It's quite interesting possibility that Shakespeare is saying our belief in witchcraft is just as childish as this. So let's examine the wording a little more closely. Hecate accuses the 3 weird sisters of being saucy and overbold, so for doing too much, trying to take on too much. "How did you dare," he asks, "how did you dare to trade and traffic with Macbeth?" Now this is the patriarchal society at work here. How can you, miserable, ugly women, dare to mess with Macbeth, the most important person in Scotland, with riddles and affairs of death? So instead of praising them for what they've done, Hecate actually criticises them. It's quite interesting, isn't it? And so the criticism here is not that they're evil, because death is obviously, bringing about people's death is evil, but that they're upsetting the social order. Hecate is attacking the witches for trying to become more powerful and influence men. And if we go a little further, what is worse, all you have done hath been but for a wayward son, spiteful and wrathful, who, as others do, loves for his own ends, not for you. So this is a strong clue as to why the Weird Sisters have become witches in the first place, is because they're not loved. And Hecate assumes that their attack on Macbeth is actually not to lead him to tragedy, it's to make Macbeth respect them, to love them. So asking for Macbeth's love. Macbeth is the wayward son that they want to love them. That's Hecate's interpretation. And Hecate criticises them because she says that Macbeth is spiteful and wrathful, so Macbeth is evil, Macbeth is full of anger, and therefore he's not capable of love, and he's not going to love you at all. And that lack of love is the same as others do. Macbeth feels about you exactly as the rest of society does. So this is a really powerful clue that Hecate thinks the Weird Sisters have turned to evil in order to overcome the effects of living in a patriarchal society that offers them no power, but also no value. They're so valueless that no one can love them for themselves. Appearance is everything if you're a woman. Now, if we look at the Witches' Chorus, we can analyse it in terms of their power. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire, burn and cauldron bubble. Again, a really childish rhyme which suggests that actually they don't have any power of evil here. And look at what they're creating. Not murder, not destruction, trouble. How innocent is that word? And it might be that this isn't used ironically at all. It's used as an actual description of the power they have. Being ugly and weird and cast-offs from society, they can engage in all this kind of ritual, but actually they don't have any real power at all. The power is all in the mind of the person they're trying to influence. And this is emphasised when the second witch talks about Macbeth's coming. By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes. The wicked description is much worse than they describe their own power, which was only to cause trouble. So this is a clear signal that the witches don't really have that much influence on Macbeth at all. It is his own wickedness. So if we look at the idea of tragedy and that fatal flaw of the hero, Hamartia or Hamartia, depending on how you pronounce it, the witches are pointing out here, it is Macbeth's own Hamartia, his ambition, that leads to this, his wickedness. It's not them. They are only exploiting something that's already within, something that Macbeth already embodies, his own evil, ambitious nature. And now Shakespeare does something rather interesting, which you might have missed. It would be very easy for the witches to have a trance or a spell or however they want to do it and tell Macbeth the visions of the future. But instead, Shakespeare removes the witches. He says that the first witch asks Macbeth, "Say if thou'st rather hear it from our mouths, us the Weird Sisters, or from our masters." Macbeth says, "Call them, let me see them." He wants to talk to the masters. Well, why introduce this idea of a master? Well, it brings us back to the patriarchal society. The witches are being controlled by another power, and that power is a male. That's why it's a master and not a mistress. In other words, he's giving a really strong clue that the witches don't have any real evil powers at all. The possibility of prophecy, of being able to look into the future, is actually not theirs. It belongs to outside forces which are, because they're more powerful, male forces masters, not female forces mistresses. But even here, Shakespeare wants to preserve the ambiguity, the question of whether evil really does have supernatural powers, or whether evil is just simply a human emotion. So, the first apparition says, Macbeth, 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 beware Macduff, beware the Thane of Fife, dismiss me, enough. Well, it looks like this is prophecy because it's Macduff who comes along and eventually kills Macbeth. But actually, it's not. This is just a reasonable assumption, and Macbeth already knows that Macduff is a dangerous character, because he says, thou hast harped my fear aright. So it's no big mystery that the first apparition decides to tell him that Macduff is a danger. The second apparition says, be bloody, bold and resolute. Laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. So this is a really ridiculous statement because every person is born of a woman. So rather than this being a prophecy that Macbeth can't be killed, we could look at it as ludicrous. It's impossible for Macbeth to be so powerful that no man could ever kill him. Or indeed no woman, because a woman would be born of a woman as well. So it's actually nonsense. And if we do look at how he's actually killed, this idea that Macbeth was from his mother's womb untimely ripped is still a bit of a cheat, isn't it? Because she's still a woman. And what happened in Shakespeare's time was that the mother would be given a caesarean, and then the baby brought out, and often women would die from the caesarean because they certainly didn't have the right sort of surgery to prevent blood loss and to make sure the woman was healed. But what they didn't do is kill the woman first and then take the baby out. That's the only technical way that this prophecy could be true, that Macduff's mother was already dead when he was born. Well, that is possible, but again, if the witches know that Macduff is the danger, they might equally know the story of Macduff's birth. You know, it wouldn't be particularly secret because his mother would have died in childbirth. So this again doesn't necessarily give us any supernatural knowledge or supernatural power at all. And Shakespeare deliberately plays with us in this way because he wants us to decide for ourselves. Does witchcraft really exist? Sure, people pretend to be witches or believe that they're witches, but actually do they have any real power, or is it all just in their own minds and the minds of the observers? Well, all right, what about the third apparition who says, Macbeth shall never vanquished be, shall never be beaten, until great Burnham Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him? Well, that does sound like supernatural knowledge, because the wood does appear to come against him when each soldier chops down branches and uses them as camouflage to hide their number. But that's not really supernatural knowledge here, perhaps. How would you, if you were attacking a castle, stop the people in the castle seeing how many soldiers you had? Well, this is the only way, and it's probably a very well-used tactic if you're laying siege to a castle. Again, it's not a mystery, it's just the third apparition saying, you're not going to be defeated until someone lays siege to your castle. Well, that doesn't take any brilliant supernatural knowledge or even any brilliant level of deduction. Sherlock Holmes didn't have to solve the case. Anyone who knew anything about warfare at the time would have been able to work this out for themselves. And it's kind of a miracle that Macbeth doesn't. But this last bit of apparent supernatural power does more strongly suggest that there is a power at work here. So the last thing that Macbeth sees from the witches' masters is a show of 8 kings, the last with a glass in his hand, a glass being a mirror, and the ghost of Banquo following. And what this is intended to show is all Banquo's descendants remaining as king long after Macbeth is dead. So this is a political act by Shakespeare, showing the whole audience how wonderful King James is, because he is rumoured to have been descended from Banquo. And so that's where the 8 kings come in. 8 generations ago we had Malcolm, who's going to take over from Macbeth. But this eventually leads to Fleance becoming king, which eventually leads to James becoming king. So if you want to argue that the witches do indeed have a supernatural power, then this is probably your best evidence, even though it's not the witches who show him this, it's their masters. This is the best evidence that they can see into the future. But if we just leave it at that, it doesn't mean that they have the power of controlling Macbeth. They are just seeing into the seeds of time. They have the gift of prophecy. They don't actually necessarily, through magic anyway, shape the future. The other possibility, of course, is that what they do is shape Macbeth's fate. So this is an interesting idea, because Malcolm becomes king at the end, just as he would have done if Macbeth had never killed Duncan, because that was the plan. That was Duncan's rule of succession. He decided that Malcolm, the Prince of Cumberland, would become king. And so Macbeth has changed nothing. That future has already been mapped out. All Macbeth has done is changed his own future. He's brought about his own early death. Again, Shakespeare suggesting that Macbeth's desires are what have destroyed him, not the influence of the riches at all. And it also points to another political fact. People who wish to become king, committing regicide, getting rid of the rightful king, like Macbeth does with Duncan, not only do they fail to succeed, they eventually die, like Macbeth does, they actually don't change history. History is already set. That's what the show of 8 kings is about. And it's set and returns to its normal path. So it's a kind of double attack on anyone who was thinking of killing King James, where Shakespeare is saying, well, it's pointless, it's going to ruin your life if you do, but more than that, you'll just be forgotten in history, because history will just swallow you up and follow its normal course. In other words, the act of killing a king is utterly pointless. Well, obviously, there'd be plenty of people who wanted power who would disagree, but Shakespeare obviously is playing a political game here, and he's just seen James survive the gunpowder plot, and he's giving out the political message to future plotters: you've got no chance, even if you've succeeded, it's pointless. The message, of course, isn't to stop them. The message is to gain the favour of the king, who will applaud Shakespeare's sentiments and message. And fittingly, the last references to the Weird Sisters, the witches, happen right at the end of the play. So Macduff talks about this prophecy that Macbeth can't be killed by a man born of a woman as a charm, a spell, deliberately echoing the witches' words when they said, "Peace, the charm's wound up." And so Macduff is suggesting that this isn't real power, it's just a rhyme. It's just something you've chosen to believe in, but actually it's not true. And Macbeth's final words about the matter, and be these juggling fiends no more believed, he recognises that it's simply belief in them that has led to this tragedy. So even in Macbeth's mind, they haven't caused the tragedy through controlling events. They have merely planted ideas in his mind. They've juggled with him. He himself is therefore the fool who has been fooled by them. So right at the very end, Macbeth realises that it's not the witch's supernatural power, but it's their exploitation of his psychology. They've got inside his mind and manipulated him, hence the juggling. They haven't caused his downfall. They've just exploited the weakness that he would already have given into. So in his own mind, he clearly blames himself. So well done. If you've got to the end of this, you've revised brilliantly. And I'll give you a free copy of my language guide if you've got to the end of this, and post a comment proving to me that you got to the end. I guess the comment will prove it, because nobody else would have got this far. So first 2 people to leave me a comment, I will give you a free copy of my language guide to the exam. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more. And I hope you've enjoyed the grade 9 analysis of the witches. And of course you could use this to analyse Lady Macbeth or Macbeth, because we've covered them in loads of detail. So that's 3 A-star essays in one. Good luck with your revision. And even if you're not studying for an exam, I hope you found this really useful. Thank you for watching.